The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, spraying crystal shards across my cheap thrift store heels. "Look at yourself, Elena," Kaelen sneered, his voice dripping with the effortless cruelty of old money. He brushed a speck of dust from his $5,000 blazer, his eyes scanning the gala hall to ensure his friends were watching the humiliation. "You're a charity case. A stain on the upholstery. My father's scholarship bought your tuition, not your right to stand next to me." He signaled the security guards with a flick of his signet ring. Two men in black suits clamped their hands onto my upper arms, their fingers digging into the bruises I'd spent my life trying to hide. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply watched the way the light hit the silver watch on Kaelen's wrist, the same watch my brother had told me would look better on a severed hand. Before the glass was even swept away, I was being dragged toward the heavy oak doors of the Sterling estate. This was the pinnacle of my 8-month charade, the moment the girl from the gutters of Naples was supposed to be cast back into the dark. Kaelen thought he was rejecting a social climber. He had no idea he was actually pulling the pin on a grenade that had been live for 20 years. If you believe Elena deserves to see the look on Kaelen's face when he realizes who she really is, hit the like button so her story reaches someone who knows the cost of pride. The rain outside was a cold, relentless sheet that turned the gravel driveway into a gray sludge. I stood under the portico, my thin dress clinging to my skin, shivering as the security guards stood like statues behind the glass. I reached into the hidden lining of my clutch and pulled out a burner phone. I didn't dial. I pressed a single button. The vibration against my palm felt like a heartbeat. On the other end there was no greeting, only the sound of a match striking and a long, slow exhale of smoke. "It's time, Dante," I whispered. The road leading up to the Sterling estate was a winding ribbon of private asphalt, accessible only by a reinforced steel gate. Suddenly, the silence of the forest was shredded by the roar of 6 black SUVs. They didn't slow down for the gate. The lead vehicle, a reinforced beast with a matte finish, slammed through the iron bars as if they were made of toothpicks. Sparks showered the gravel. The security guards at the door reached for their radios, their faces pale under the flickering portico lights. One guard dropped his hand when he saw the red laser dots dancing across his chest. The SUVs screeched to a halt in a perfect semicircle, their headlights blinding the gala guests who began to spill onto the balcony to witness the intrusion. The doors of the lead vehicle opened. Out stepped a man whose silhouette was a sharp, jagged edge against the headlights. Dante didn't wear a tuxedo. He wore a dark leather coat that smelled of gunpowder and expensive tobacco. He walked through the rain without an umbrella, the water rolling off his shoulders as he approached the steps where I stood. He stopped in front of me, his eyes scanning my face for the mark of a tear. Finding none, he reached out and tucked a stray wet hair behind my ear. His fingers were calloused and steady. Kaelen stepped out from the gala doors, his arrogance still shielding him from the reality of the red dots. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice cracking as he tried to regain his footing. "This is private property. I'll have you arrested before you reach the end of the driveway." Dante didn't look at him. He didn't even acknowledge Kaelen's existence until he had draped his heavy leather coat over my shivering shoulders. Then Dante turned slowly. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. The 6 men standing behind him, their hands resting on suppressed submachine guns, were the only statement he needed to make. "You're Kaelen Sterling," Dante said, his voice a low rhythmic vibration that seemed to vibrate the very air. "The boy who thinks a scholarship makes him a god." He walked up the steps, his boots leaving muddy prints on the white marble that Kaelen loved so much. Dante stopped 6 inches from Kaelen's face. The heir took a step back, his heel catching on the threshold. Dante reached out and gripped Kaelen's silk tie, tightening it until the boy's face began to turn a mottled purple. "My sister spent 8 months listening to your filth. She stayed because I asked her to. But now, Kaelen, I'm the one asking the questions." Dante leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And my first question is, where is the ledger your father stole from my family's vault in Naples?" The gala guests were frozen, a sea of silk and diamonds turned into a tableau of terror. Kaelen's father, Arthur Sterling, appeared in the doorway, his face the color of old parchment. He recognized Dante. He recognized the crest embroidered on the sleeves of the men in the rain. "Dante Moretti," Arthur gasped, his hands shaking as he gripped the doorframe. "We had an agreement." Dante let go of Kaelen's tie, allowing the boy to slump to the floor, gasping for air. Dante turned his gaze toward the father, his eyes as cold as the rain behind him. "The agreement ended when your son put his hands on my sister," Dante said. He pulled a heavy, gold-plated lighter from his pocket and flicked it open. The flame danced in the wind. "You have 10 minutes to bring the ledger out here, Arthur. If you don't, I'm going to see if this marble burns as well as your reputation." Arthur scrambled back into the house, his polished shoes slipping on the floor. I walked over to Kaelen, who was still on his knees, staring at the gravel. I knelt down so my face was level with his. I didn't feel pity. I felt the weight of 10 years of exile. "The scholarship was a nice touch, Kaelen," I said, my voice steady. "But you were right about one thing. I don't belong here." I reached out and took the silver watch from his wrist, the clasp snapping in my hand. I dropped it into the mud. "I belong with the people who don't need a name on a building to own the city." Dante's hand settled on my shoulder, a silent anchor. 10 minutes passed like an eternity. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of the rain and the idling engines of the SUVs. At the 9-minute mark, Arthur Sterling returned. He wasn't carrying a ledger. He was carrying a small velvet-lined box. His eyes weren't on Dante, they were darting toward the woods at the edge of the property. Dante saw it too. He didn't reach for the box. He grabbed my arm and pulled me behind the reinforced door of the SUV just as the first sniper round shattered the marble pillar where I had been standing. The world dissolved into a cacophony of breaking glass and shouting. Dante's men didn't scramble. They moved with a synchronized, lethal grace, returning fire into the darkness of the trees. Dante shoved me into the back seat of the SUV, the heavy armor plating thudding shut. Through the bulletproof glass, I saw Arthur Sterling standing in the doorway, a twisted smile on his face as he realized his trap had sprung. He wasn't giving up the ledger. He was trying to erase the only two people who knew it existed. Dante stayed outside, his pistol barking as he moved toward the source of the sniper fire, his face a mask of cold, focused rage. One of Dante's men, a giant of a man named Marco, slammed the SUV into gear. The tires roared against the gravel as we spun around, creating a shield for Dante. I watched through the rear window as Dante dove into the passenger seat, his leather coat shredded by glass shards. "Drive," he roared. We barreled through the ruins of the gate, the black SUVs fanning out to draw the fire of the hidden shooters. As we hit the main road, Dante turned to me, his hand bleeding onto the leather upholstery. "He's moved the ledger, Elena. He's taking it to the vault at the docks." I gripped the seat, the momentum of the car throwing me back. If you believe the Moretti family never leaves a debt unpaid, drop a like so the algorithm knows the story matters. The drive to the docks was a high-speed blur of neon lights and screeching brakes. Dante was on his phone, his voice barking commands in rapid-fire Italian. We weren't just fleeing, we were coordinating a siege. By the time we reached the shipping yards, 4 more SUVs had joined our convoy. The cranes loomed over the water like skeletal giants, and the smell of salt and diesel was thick enough to taste. Arthur Sterling's silver limousine was parked at the edge of Pier 9, surrounded by a dozen men in tactical gear. They weren't bodyguards, they were mercenaries. Dante stepped out of the car before it had even fully stopped. He didn't wait for his men. He walked toward the limousine, the rain turning his blood into a pink smear on his hand. Arthur Sterling stepped out of the back seat, holding the velvet box like a shield. "You're out of your depth, Dante," Arthur shouted over the wind. "This isn't Naples. I have the police, the ports, and the politicians in my pocket." Dante didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. "You have their pockets, Arthur," Dante said, his voice carrying over the crashing waves. "But I have their fear." Suddenly, the lights of the entire pier flickered and died. In the darkness, the only thing visible were the red laser dots, dozens of them appearing on the chests of Arthur's mercenaries. They weren't Dante's dots. From the shadows of the shipping containers, men in dark uniforms emerged. They weren't Moretti soldiers. They were the Port Authority police, led by a man Dante had spent the last 8 months bribing with the very money Kaelen thought I didn't have. Arthur's mercenaries dropped their weapons, the clatter of steel on concrete sounding like a funeral march. Dante walked up to Arthur and snatched the velvet box from his shaking hands. He opened it, the glow of a nearby emergency light hitting the ancient, leather-bound ledger inside. Dante didn't look at the names. He looked at the final page where our father's signature had been forged. He ripped the page out and handed it to me. I took a lighter from Dante's pocket and held the flame to the paper. We watched as the evidence of our family's ruin turned to ash and blew away into the Atlantic. Arthur Sterling slumped against his limousine, his empire collapsing in the time it took for a piece of paper to burn. Kaelen was in the back seat, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with a terror that no scholarship could ever fix. Dante leaned into the limousine window, his face inches from Kaelen's. "The scholarship is cancelled, Kaelen," Dante said. "But don't worry. I've arranged a new place for you to stay. It has very thick walls and no marble floors." Dante signaled the officers, who moved in to zip-tie Arthur and Kaelen Sterling. We stood on the edge of the pier as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the water into a bruised purple. Dante draped his coat over my shoulders again, his hand resting on the back of my neck. I looked at the ledger, the weight of 10 years of hiding finally lifting from my chest. We weren't the poor girl and the Mafia boss anymore. We were the Morettis, and the city finally knew it. Dante looked at me, a rare, small smile touching his lips. "Where to now, Elena?" I looked at the city skyline, the lights of the Sterling estate finally going dark in the distance. "Home, Dante," I said. "Take me home." If this story broke your heart the way it broke mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. The return to Naples was a silent, private flight. I sat by the window watching the clouds, the silver watch I'd taken from Kaelen sitting on the table in front of me. Dante was across the aisle, cleaning the glass from his coat. We didn't talk about the gala. We didn't talk about the snipers. We talked about the garden our mother used to keep, and the way the air smelled of lemons in the spring. The ledger was tucked safely in a steel briefcase bolted to the floor. It wasn't just paper anymore, it was our future. When we landed, the heat of the Italian sun hit me like a physical embrace. We drove through the winding streets of the city, the people nodding with a quiet, deep respect as Dante's car passed. We reached the villa, the iron gates swinging open to reveal the house that had been stolen from us when I was 6 years old. I stepped out of the car, my feet finally hitting the stone I was born to walk on. Dante stood beside me looking at the house. "It needs work," he said. I looked at him and laughed, the sound bright and clear for the first time in a decade. "We have time, Dante. We have all the time in the world." Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who risked everything for the truth. The first dinner in the villa was simple: bread, wine, and the sound of the Mediterranean. Dante sat at the head of the table, his leather coat replaced by a simple linen shirt. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. "You're staying, Elena?" I looked at the silver watch on my wrist, the one I had repaired and fitted for myself. "Try and move me, Dante," I said. We raised our glasses, the crystal clinking in the quiet room. The arrogant heir was a ghost, the poor girl was a memory, and the Mafia boss was just a brother again. The ledger sat on the mantelpiece, a reminder of the cost of our return. But as the moon rose over the Bay of Naples, I realized that the real power wasn't in the names in the book. It was in the fact that we were still standing and we weren't standing alone. The silence of the Naples villa was interrupted by a sound that didn't belong, the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a drone. I stood on the terrace, the lemon-scented air suddenly turned cold as the black insect-like machine hovered just 10 feet away, its camera lens tracking my every move. It wasn't the police and it wasn't a curious neighbor. Attached to the landing gear was a small, translucent vial filled with a vibrant, neon blue liquid, the signature calling card of the Blue Syndicate, the very group Arthur Sterling had been trying to sell our ledger to. If you believe that the past never truly dies, it just waits for you to get comfortable, hit the like button so Elena knows she's still in the fight. Dante appeared behind me, his hand already on the hilt of the serrated blade he kept at his lower back. He didn't look at the drone. He looked at the treeline beyond the villa walls. "They didn't come for the ledger, Elena," he whispered, his voice like grinding stones. "They came for the chemist." I looked at my hands, the fingers that had spent 8 months serving champagne also being the same fingers that held a doctorate in molecular pharmacology, the real reason the Moretti family was so valuable. My poor girl act hadn't just been to spy on Kaelen. It was to hide the fact that I was the only person alive who knew the formula for the syndicate's most profitable synthetic. The drone suddenly lurched forward, dropping the vial onto the stone tiles. It didn't shatter, it hissed, releasing a thick, sweet-smelling vapor that made the world tilt. Dante grabbed my waist, hauling me back into the house and slamming the glass doors shut, but the seal wasn't airtight. My lungs burned as if I were swallowing needles. "The basement," Dante barked, shoving a damp cloth into my hand. We scrambled down the stone stairs into the reinforced wine cellar, the heavy iron door clanging shut with a finality that felt like a coffin lid. In the dim light of the cellar, Dante's face was a mask of calculated fury. He pulled a hidden panel behind a rack of vintage Barolo, revealing a terminal connected to the villa's perimeter sensors. The screen was a swarm of red dots. We weren't being raided, we were being harvested. "They're not using lead," Dante said, watching the heat signatures move through the gardens. "They're using incapacitants. They want you conscious but broken. He handed me a small injector from his medical kit. This is a stimulant. It'll counteract the vapor, but it'll make your heart feel like it's going to explode. You have to choose, Elena. We wait and get taken, or we go out there and burn the garden. I took the injector and slammed it into my thigh before I could overthink the pain. A surge of artificial electricity roared through my veins, my vision sharpening until I could see the individual grains of dust dancing in the air. We burn it, I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. Dante handed me a compact submachine gun, his eyes reflecting a grim pride. We didn't use the stairs. We used the service tunnel that led to the boathouse, emerging into the humid night just as the first syndicate strike team reached the terrace. The fight wasn't a standoff, it was a slaughter. Under the influence of the stimulant, I moved like a blur, the weapon in my hand an extension of my rage. Dante was a whirlwind of steel, his movements so fast the mercenaries didn't even have time to raise their dart guns. We reached the boathouse just as a sleek, black speedboat began to pull away. On the deck stood a woman I recognized from the Sterling Gala, Arthur's assistant, her face now cold and triumphant as she held a locked briefcase. My briefcase. The one containing the base formula. Dante didn't stop to aim. He dove into the water, his powerful strokes cutting through the wake of the boat. I stood on the pier, my heart thudding at a dangerous, erratic rhythm. I didn't have a boat, but I had the villa's remote defense system. I pulled the tablet from my belt and swiped across the screen, activating the underwater pylons we'd installed for emergencies. A series of high-frequency pulses erupted from beneath the waves, the vibration so intense it shattered the speedboat's hull from the inside out. The explosion was a muffled thump, followed by a geyser of white foam. I watched as the boat settled into the dark water of the bay. Dante emerged a minute later, dragging the woman by her hair with one hand and clutching the briefcase with the other. He tossed her onto the pier like a piece of driftwood. She coughed up salt water, looking up at us with a terrified, wide-eyed stare. You think this is over?" she wheezed. "The syndicate has eyes in every lab in Europe. You're just a girl who got lucky." Dante knelt beside her, his face inches from hers. He didn't use a weapon. He just showed her the signet ring on his finger, the one that had belonged to our father. "She isn't a girl who got lucky," Dante said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "She's the reason your syndicate is going to go bankrupt by morning. Because while you were chasing this briefcase, she was uploading the poison pill into your servers." I looked at the tablet in my hand. The progress bar was at 100%. The formula in the briefcase was now a series of chemical dead ends. The real data had been erased and replaced with a virus that would fry any system that tried to read it. The woman's face crumbled as she realized the scale of the deception. We hadn't just defended the villa, we had executed a digital assassination. Dante stood up and looked out at the horizon, where the first hint of gray was touching the sky. The stimulant was starting to wear off, a heavy, crushing fatigue settling into my bones. Dante caught me before my knees hit the stone. "It's over, Elena," he whispered. "The names are gone. The formulas are gone. We're just ghosts again." We sat on the pier until the sun fully rose, the briefcase sitting between us like a discarded toy. We didn't go back to the villa. We took a small old wooden boat and rowed out into the center of the bay. I watched as Dante dropped the briefcase into the deep blue water, the sunlight catching the metal one last time before it vanished into the abyss. There was no more ledger. There were no more secrets. Just the two of us, the lemon trees, and a name that finally meant nothing to the world and everything to us. The morning after the bay was a hollow, ringing silence. My heart had finally slowed from the stimulant, leaving behind a dull ache that felt like a permanent reminder of the night I stopped being a victim. Dante sat across from me on the terrace, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee, his knuckles still split and raw. We didn't look like heirs to a throne, we looked like two people who had just survived a shipwreck. The Blue Syndicate was blinded, their servers turned to ash by the virus I'd released, but in our world, a wounded beast is more dangerous than a hungry one. A silver tray sat on the table between us, but there was no champagne. Instead, there was a single hand-delivered envelope made of thick cream cardstock. It bore the crest of the Commission, the hidden council that governed the shadow world of Italy. They didn't care about synthetic formulas or old ledgers. They cared about the fact that the Moretti name was back on the map, and we hadn't asked for permission. If you think the only thing more dangerous than an enemy is a friend who wants a seat at your table, hit the like button so the Morettas can see the trap coming. "They want us to attend the convocation in Rome," Dante said, his voice sandpaper dry. He tossed the invitation onto the table. "They call it a reconciliation. I call it a firing squad. I picked up the card. The edges were gilded, the ink smelling of expensive iron. To ignore was an act of war. To attend was a gamble with our lives. I looked at Dante and for the first time, I saw the flicker of something that wasn't rage in his eyes. It was exhaustion. He had spent 10 years being a shield. He didn't know how to be a person. I stood up, the linen of my dress catching the Mediterranean breeze. We aren't going to Rome to reconcile, I said, my voice finally finding its steel without the help of an injector. We're going to show them that the Moretti family doesn't take orders from a council that watched our parents burn. Dante looked up, a slow, dark grin spreading across his face, the look that made the Sterling family tremble. You want to burn the commission, Elena? I leaned over the table, my shadow falling over the gilded card. I want to make them obsolete. The drive to Rome was a procession of shadow and light. We traveled in a single armored vintage car, no convoy, no sirens. We wanted to look vulnerable. We wanted them to think the poor girl and the thug were coming to beg for their lives. The convocation was held in a private palazzo beneath the ruins of the Roman Forum. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and centuries-old secrets. 12 chairs were arranged in a circle, 10 of them occupied by men who looked like statues carved from ice. As we entered, the heavy iron doors groaned shut behind us. The man at the head of the circle, an ancient patriarch named Don Valley, gestured to the 2 empty chairs. The Moretti children, he wheezed, his eyes milky with cataracts but sharp with greed. You have caused a great deal of noise for 2 people who were supposed to be dead. Dante didn't sit. He stood behind my chair, his hands resting on my shoulders. It was a clear message. I was the voice of the family now. The noise was necessary to wake you up, Don Valley, I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The Blue Syndicate is gone. Arthur Sterling is in a cage. And the formula that could have poisoned this country is at the bottom of the sea. A murmur rippled through the old men. One of them slammed a fist onto his mahogany table. That formula belonged to the commission. You destroyed a €1 billion asset to settle a personal grudge. I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small digital tablet, sliding it into the center of the circle. I didn't destroy it, I lied, my face a mask of perfect composure. I secured it. The tablet you see is a live link to a cloud server. If my heart rate drops below 60 beats per minute, or if I don't enter a code every 6 hours, the formula is sent directly to the Italian National Police and Interpol. The room went deathly silent. Dante's grip on my shoulders tightened slightly, the only sign of his surprise. I was bluffing with a dead hand, but in this room, perception was the only reality. You're holding the world hostage? Valley asked, a hint of admiration creeping into his raspy tone. I leaned forward, the candlelight catching the silver watch on my wrist. I'm holding the Moretti family's safety. We want the villa in Naples declared neutral ground. We want the bounty on Dante's head revoked. And we want the commission to forget we ever existed. The elders whispered among themselves, a frantic, hushed sound like dry leaves in the wind. They were businessmen, and the risk of total exposure outweighed the profit of a synthetic drug. Don Valley stood up, leaning heavily on a cane topped with a silver wolf's head. You have your neutrality, Elena Moretti. But know this, if that link ever triggers, there is no corner of the earth far enough for you to hide. I stood up, nodding once. We walked out of the palazzo, the iron doors opening for us this time. We didn't run. We walked through the moonlit ruins of the Forum, the ghosts of old emperors watching us pass. When we reached the car, Dante finally exhaled, a sound of pure disbelief. You don't have a link, do you? He asked, opening the door for me. I looked at my hands, which were finally starting to shake. I have a heart and a tablet with a screensaver of a countdown clock, Dante. That's all. He barked a laugh, a loud, genuine sound that bounced off the ancient stone walls. He pulled me into a brief, crushing hug. You're more of a Moretti than I ever was. We drove out of Rome as the sun began to rise, the city of marble and blood fading in the rearview mirror. We returned to the villa in Naples, but this time the gates stayed open. We spent the next month rebuilding the lemon groves, the sound of the sea replaced by the sound of workers and laughter. Dante traded his leather coat for a gardener's apron, his hands learning the gentleness required to prune a tree instead of a man's life. And me? I opened a small clinic in the village, using the clean money Dante had hidden away to help the people the commission had spent decades stepping on. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Bay of Naples in strokes of violet and gold, I saw a familiar black SUV parked at the edge of our property. My heart skipped, but I didn't reach for a weapon. Julian Vane stepped out of the vehicle, looking older, his suit replaced by a simple linen shirt. He walked up to the terrace, holding a small box tied with a silk ribbon. "I heard the Moretti family was under new management," he said, handing me the box. Inside was a simple handcrafted compass made of brass and silver. On the back, an inscription was etched in tiny, precise letters, "To the girl who found her own way home." I looked at Julian, then at Dante, who was walking up from the groves, wiping dirt from his brow. We weren't enemies and we weren't allies. We were just survivors who had finally found a place where the shadows couldn't reach us. Subscribe if you believe that the strongest families aren't built on blood and ledgers, but on the courage to leave the past behind.